Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by
DHG is a full-service accounting firm serving Memphis and the Mid-South region for more than 60 years, combining community involvement with the technical resources of a national firm. For more information, visit dhgllp.com.
the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
The first year of the new school systems in Arlington and Lakeland, tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by Ted Horrell, superintendent from the Lakeland School System. Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
And Tammy Mason, superintendent of Arlington Community Schools. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And Bill Dries, senior reporter with the Memphis Daily News. And so we were talking before the show, it's about a year ago that we had you all on, and you were saying before the show, we're taping this on Thursday, it was a year ago today that you took possession of your schools. It's
right.
An amazing run. How did it go?
That is correct, yes. A year ago today, we got the keys to the buildings and walked in and thought, now these are all ours.
Uh-oh.
And what have we gotten ourselves into?
Well,
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But how was the first year? I mean,
Just amazing. You know, when sitting back and reflecting on it, it went better than I think that any of us hoped that it would have.
yeah. Ted?
Well, yeah, you had several things that you can't help but be concerned about, and they include your culture and your staffing and just the operation and the day-to-day, and certainly the financial piece was a huge one. We were confident that, you know, we would get the funding that we needed to make it work within our budgets, but you're still not quite sure until you do it, and then you get to the end of the year, and I think we had an amazing year, and the teachers left with such a great feeling and a sense of accomplishment, and I think that all of the systems, my understanding, I know certainly ours are under budget, and it's been terrific, just terrific.
And you know, all this comes out of the consolidation, the merger, the demerger. We won't rehash all that, but there was so much that was going on. This show devoted so much time to so many articles about it. All of that, and then you, I guess in January of 2014, give or take, you all were hired by your respective school boards, had that spring to put your staffs together and so on and so forth. But all of this you're trying to do, and by the way, the kids have to be educated in the classroom.
Right.
How do you, it was almost a sense that you had to protect the kids from all of this that was going on? Is that a fair way of looking at it? Or?
Well, I think, you know, obviously our focus was on operational issues, and we put our staff in place to work with our school leaders, and they really did the heavy lifting for curriculum and the educational piece that first semester because we were so focused on the operational. And at the district level, we've really been able to start looking at the curriculum piece, the educational piece, making sure we have the right people in the right places for that. But really, I have to give kudos to our school leaders, our school principals and assistant principals, because they really did that part of the heavy lift in the first semester last year.
Right.
Absolutely, and I think we all said at some point, if we do our jobs when the new system's open, at best nobody will know the difference. Because by the time the kids get in the classrooms with the teachers, that's where the real work happens, and that's where the most important work happens. But I think what we found is they did notice a difference, and they felt like it was better.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's
But, well, let's get Billy.
So to build on what happened in the first year, while we've had all these changes going on locally, there have also been changes at the state level, and I think. What you're about to hear from the state is about the TCAP adjustments and what the scores really mean. So how significant is that adjustment in the scores? What have you been told about that at this point?
That's a great question. Go ahead, Tam.
Yeah, well, you know, what we know is that there's really no correlation between the quick scores, which is what the parents and students see on their report cards, versus what the proficiency levels are. And I think so what our biggest role is right now is not only understanding that, but making sure that we communicate that to our parents and our students, but more importantly, our teachers. And because there's a lot of confusion out there when they receive those quick scores and those grades, that they thought that equated to the proficiency levels, which it does not. And so I think right now what our biggest job is communication and getting that information out, and then getting what are those proficiency levels, which we should get in mid-June.
Right. The other topic that comes up on a statewide basis is our transition out of Common Core to whatever the state standards are next. So with all of this debate in Nashville, in the legislature, how much have each of you heard from parents actually about Common Core?
We've heard quite a bit about it and concerns about it, and I think it's a continuation of the disconnect that we've had between the standards and the assessments, and we keep they keep leapfrogging another. We get standards that we'll get a new standards, and the assessments haven't caught up yet, and now we've got a new assessment come in, and we've got some changes in the standards. So I think there are certainly, I've heard specific concerns about the Common Core standards, but also more general concerns about the culture of testing and the emphasis and the position that it's putting teachers in terms of which, kind of having their feet in two different streams, as they say sometimes, and trying to figure out what to do, in terms of instruction.
Yeah, it's just been that constant transition, which has caused a misalignment between curriculums and assessments. And so we're hopeful that we are nearing the end of that misalignment, that we can get those two on the same page. In looking at my community, that's really been the biggest concern, is that misalignment around the standards and the assessment.
Right, and when there are these assessments, I don't know if I'm using the term correctly, but a lot of times when a teacher throws out a problem to students, let's say at the beginning of a math class, that's not a Common Core thing necessarily. That's to determine where a student is, who needs intervention. It's part of the intervention strategy?
That is correct. There's a lot of pre-assessments that go on, a lot of interventions and enrichments as a result of that.
Mm-hmm. I think it's what we think of as just good teaching, finding out where are the students when you get them, so that you can know what you need to spend your time teaching them.
Right, yeah. But to a parent, I'm sure you get feedback that this was a test. And why are you constantly testing them? And it's not aligned with TCAP necessarily.
That is correct. We do hear a lot from teachers too about that. There's over-testing, and really it's just part of the learning process if done correctly.
Because there's all kinds of software now where I watched a math teacher in one classroom give his students a math problem as soon as they came into his room.
Right.
And they began calculating it, and he watched from a tablet as their problems were graded automatically right in front of him. He knew that half of the class had gotten the problem right already. He knew which students were working it out, which were struggling with it, and adjusted accordingly. It's a big change in the classroom, I would imagine.
Yes, definitely. And I know at Arlington High School, a lot of the teachers use the QR readers, codes, to be able to do exactly what you've demonstrated. It allows teachers to make better use of their time, the instructional time that the kids are in class, really targeting on what their needs are instead of what a curriculum says on a piece of paper.
And is it, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think the difference is, if done correctly, that's not high stakes. There's not a grade. There's not pressure. The teacher's not saying you got to get this right or I'm not going to keep my job. Those kind of things, again, if handled correctly, really just help the teacher and the student figure out what they need to learn. So I think when done well, like what Tammy's describing, we don't get as much feedback on that being a problem.
Right.
Would you like to see less of the standardized tests, though, less emphasis on it, or is it back to what you said, where you feel like things are getting aligned and it's fine?
I think that once we get everything aligned, then that will just be the natural process, because there's always been that standardized test. Now, obviously, the emphasis on what it all means as far as teacher accountability and student accountability with the grading, that has increased over the years. But I think once we get it aligned, it will become just part of the process, and then won't be highlighted as much as it is now.
Let's shift in. You have a high school. Ted does not. So just for you, there's a similar debate about even AP. About SATs, ACTs, and all that on the college prep track.
Correct.
So much testing. I know teachers of AP who say, look, don't blame me that we go so fast. I know when the test is going to be given. It's a national test. It's May 20th or May 15th or whatever.
Right.
I subdivide the weeks I have, and that's the speed at which we go. And I wish we could touch more on this or touch more on that, but I have to get your kid to the end of the rainbow of this AP course, and be it AP in science or in math or English or the history or whatever. Do you feel, and there's some debate, nationally, that there's too much emphasis on that?
Yeah, I think there is to a large degree. You know, in high school, you're looking at teachers that are in really 3 different pockets of testing. You've got your EOC teachers, which are your state testing, your AP teachers,
right,
and then you have your ACT, which are all 11th graders.
Right.
And so all of those kind of focus on what those standards are, you know, from the high school levels, and what the high school teachers really want is better alignment between those ACT standards and what the state standards are at the high school.
Right, right. So I mentioned, okay, so high school. I mentioned Lakeland right now has just the elementary school. You all are going through a process. I think the board this week said, let's go forward with perhaps building a middle school. There was a referendum in April to raise $50 million that didn't pass. What's your sense of where you're going in terms of the growth of the school system?
Sure. I think all of the school systems are kind of looking at the capital piece. We spent a lot of time and had a lot of research on operational funding and what that was going to look like, and that was really an emphasis for this year, and I think you see it in other municipalities too. Now we're all trying to assess kind of what is our facility situation and does it meet our needs. The facilities were placed with no regard to municipalities, and now we have these municipal borders. So we're going through that process, and obviously our first plan was not accepted by the voters. But we learned a lot from that conversation in terms of timing and finances, and so we just take that in stride and move on.
Let's do numbers for a second. You have how many kids in the elementary school?
About 850.
And your sense is you need to be able to accommodate how many middle schoolers and high schoolers over the next what period of time? You know, what's that vision that drove the sense that we need these 2 new schools?
Sure. We have 500 middle school students in grades 6 through 8. Our plan at this point would be to build a 5 through 8 school, which would create some more room at the elementary school. So we'd have about 750.
And those
students.
kids go to Arlington or Bartlett, or would they go wherever? Or you have them all. Correct me. How many Lakeland kids are there? Say it again. From 5 to 8. Those are kids currently in your elementary school or currently in other schools?
Well, they're actually, we have elementary students at Lakeland Elementary, and we have about 200 at Donaldson Elementary in Arlington Community Schools.
Okay, and then how many, the high school was meant for how many potential high school kids?
Well, we've got right now 700 high school kids, and so if we had combined, it would have been about 1,200 or 1,300.
Okay. Sorry, my apologies for getting messed up on the numbers. We were talking before the show, and something that I didn't realize, which is the way in which you were talking about it, that kids from out of your district can come to your school, and they can apply to come in. And it's another part. We had Dorsey Hobson and Chris Barbick talking about the ASD schools and the underperforming schools and the tremendous competition going on among them, friendly, but tremendously competitive. For resources for teachers and for these kids and to improve. You all, to some degree, all of the suburban schools compete in the sense that you have kids from out of your district coming in. Talk a little bit about that dynamic.
Yeah, certainly I think that probably the education in Shelby County is as competitive educationally as anywhere that you can find right now. For Arlington, we're in a pretty good spot as far as our buildings and the space that we have. We have in our district a little over 600 kids that do not live in our attendance zones, which are Arlington and Lakeland, depending upon the grade structure. The majority of those kids are at the high school. I have over 400 at the high school. We also have kids that are coming outside of Shelby County from Fayette County. Currently this year we have enrolled right at about 60 kids, and we've already approved right at 100 kids for going into the next school year from Fayette County. And our board felt like it was very important to put together and approve a non-resident policy to allow kids that did not live in our attendance zones, if we have space and they meet certain criteria, to attend, because we feel like the education in our community is our responsibility, not only for the kids within our attendance zone, but if we have that space to allow those others to come in.
And then how does the funding work? Not to be callous about kids, human beings, but how does the funding work for those kids that are out of town or out of county?
Sure. Well, within county, the money follows them, both the local and the state money follows them. The only money that does not follow them is the City of Arlington money. And for the Fayette County kids, the state money follows them, but the local money does not. And so therefore, the Fayette County kids, there is a tuition that is equivalent to what the local funding is for Shelby County students. And so it's just a little over $3,100 a year.
Okay, all right. Okay, good. Bill.
Let's talk a bit about technology in the classrooms as well, because we've seen blended learning, a rollout of that in Shelby County schools as well. What's the state of technology in your respective school systems at this point?
Sure, it's been a major emphasis for us. We, as a small system, obviously we didn't have a lot of central office, you'd call it staffing, I guess, but we did allot one position to an instructional technology specialist that's full-time in the building. And really what she's trying to do is build up capacity for the technology that is right now flooding into the schools. We got a tremendous amount of donations from our PTA and from the Lakeland Education Foundation, so we've put just dozens and dozens of new laptops and tablets in the building, and we're investing in the technology infrastructure this summer. That was actually approved last night to the tune of about $40,000, so that I think we're all headed towards either bring your own device or one-to-one type things where students come to school and do what they do when they get out of school, which is walk around and learn and get information from the internet. So we're trying to build that capacity in our staff right now. It's a major priority for us, for sure.
Yeah, and it's a priority for us. It was one of the centerpieces in our 5-year strategic capital plan was technology. We are starting a one-on-one initiative in our middle school next year. We're starting with our 6th grade, and we're piloting one of the teams. We've sent staff members to other districts that have implemented that, recognizing that it's just not as simple as putting a device in a child's hands. There's got to be teacher training that goes along with that because it's a different way of teaching. So we're beginning that process, and hopefully by the end of next school year, we'll have it in all of 6th and 7th graders' hands, and then in year 3 of that, all middle school kids, that is the way that they will learn. At the high school level, we've created a policy that the board has approved to allow them to bring their own devices to do some of the things that you talked about earlier, using the QR reader and things of that to facilitate instruction. Infrastructure, we have that in our capital plan as well to do some pretty major renovations for our infrastructure. A little over $500,000 is what we're anticipating that will cost. So we certainly recognize that's a major priority, as well as our STEM program that we're beginning next year, that we have put about $250,000 into buying equipment for that program.
I want to come back to some of the things you said, but just on the technology thing and the devices. Devices would be anything from an iPad, a tablet,
yes,
to a laptop or whatever.
Correct.
What about, I've got teenagers. They get a phone in front of them or something, and the distraction level can be frustrating as a parent. And so I would imagine as a teacher, there's all these great opportunities that come with this. That's obvious.
Yes.
But how do you manage, and I've heard other parents talk about laptops in classrooms and the ability of kids, how do you discipline that or monitor the use of all these devices in the classroom? There's only one teacher in there, and the kids are real smart and they're real adept at getting onto Facebook, Twitter, or wherever they want to get to. How do you manage that side?
Well, a couple different ways. That's one of the reasons why we're starting small, making sure that we have good policies and procedures around that, and also training the kids. But also in looking at our networks is, we have things like Facebook and Twitter and those kind of things blocked, so that they cannot get within our network. Access those items, and then making sure that there's agreements that students sign and parents sign, knowing that if they don't follow these, then they will not be able to use those devices. And so, but as with everything, it is a teaching. That's why we're being very purposeful about it, and not just handing a device and all the middle school kids' hands without going through that process.
Yeah. Your thoughts on that same question?
I think like most issues in education, at the end of the day, it comes down to that teacher in the classroom.
Yes.
I always say it's the teacher, it's the teacher, it's the, it just, back in we've been dissecting frogs for, I don't know how many years, for forever. And that's a distraction for kids that have a little poker and a frog that's opened up. Yeah. And if you've got the right teacher, it can happen smoothly and in a way that kids learn what they need to. And if it's not facilitated in a way that's engaging, I think it's mainly engagement. If the kids have a task that they're excited about using technology to complete, I've found they will use the technology to do that. If it's not a good lesson, and if it's there's
then they're going to
drifting off, then they're going to see if they can figure out a way around the Facebook firewall.
Okay.
And that's why that teacher training piece is so important with technology.
Yeah, right. What are the rough this seems like a distraction, but the rough teacher-student ratios? Let's start with you.
We have at our middle school, we reduced our ratios down. It's 1 to 25.
Okay.
And for our 3 through 5, it's 1 to 24, and for our K2, it's 1 to 20.
Okay. Okay, and you
We're down to about 1 to 19 at the
1 to
elementary
19.
school.
Okay,
Yeah.
so a reasonable sort of number. How we talked about Chris Barwick again, just because they're fresh in my mind last week, and there's just so much attention right now. Scores at the lower performing schools. Obviously, none of your schools are not in that low performing part, but you've got kids who come in who, whatever reason, are unprepared. Okay, they've transferred in for whatever reason, they are unprepared. How? I mean, you look at the problem of a failing school, and you've got a whole school and a whole culture and a whole, but you've got a teacher, say, with 25 kids in there, and you've got a couple of kids who are just really not ready.
Yeah.
How does your school system deal with those kids? Because the teacher's got 23 kids who want to keep moving real fast, let's say, and 2 or 3 kids who are not at that speed. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, all of our schools, and beginning this year, even at the high school level, have a time built in every day to address individual students' needs.
Yeah.
And so the schools do benchmarking about 3 times a year, and that benchmarking gives the information to the teachers on which students need what information, whether it's intervention, whether it's enrichment. And so that time is embedded within the school day, and the kids run through that schedule. The problem comes is when you don't have that time allotted in the day, and you don't train teachers to know what they're supposed to do. Additionally, we have hired staff to do interventions in all of our grade levels to address that specifically. So it may not be that particular classroom teacher, but somebody that's been hired to specifically help the teacher assist in those needs that students may have.
Your take on that? I mean, again, we because there's a kind of a really unfair, and it's probably the media that probably my fault, our fault, that you all are dealt this hand where everybody's great, everybody's upper middle class, everybody's prepared, they come to school clothed and fed, and it's all just rainbows and happiness. They're tough kids with really tough circumstances that you're teaching. How do you focus and handle that part of your population?
Well, I think you have to make it a priority, and I think, as Tammy said, one of the main resources that we have that is finite is time, and so you have to decide how to distribute that time. We spent kind of this year taking a look at it and what had been in place, and we've spent a significant amount of time this spring and already this summer kind of restructuring that. So we're going to have a new schedule for that very reason, frankly.
Yeah.
We not only want to make sure that the students that are struggling get that help, but we feel like we need to do a better job because we have such a large group of high-performing students. We need to push them harder. I mean, we need to make sure we're challenging them as well. So, and again, I think it comes down to the time and the structure and the procedures to not only identify those students, but make sure that they're getting what they need during the school day.
Okay, and just 3 or 4 minutes left, Bill.
And much of that goes back to intervention. I see less and less of the classroom that I came up in where the students are all sitting in rows and a teacher is talking to everyone at the same time.
Right.
Is that model gone, or is it just a lot less prevalent than it was?
Probably the latter. I think that is now considered one element of what a successful lesson might look like, where that used to be maybe the whole lesson. But just less emphasis on what we call stand and deliver, where the teacher just kind of talks. We start off that way, but then we're going to break it down into smaller groups, and you might have another teacher come in, or you might have some kids pull out, or you might have a teacher's assistant that comes and helps a small group of students that are struggling. And I think that's one small part of it rather than kind of what teaching looks like now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're really looking at multiple strategies that's used, and teachers are really told that method is, you shouldn't use that really more than 20 or 25% of your time, because if the kids aren't engaged in the learning, at that point, if teachers are just standing in front of the classroom, then they become disseminators of information, but you don't ever know what kids are actually learning. And so that engagement piece is very important. And so I think it's a combination of strategies that teachers use to make sure, because all kids learn differently.
Yeah, I've been in classrooms where I come in along with other media and some with cameras, and if it's stand and deliver, invariably we're going to get a lot of looks in the back of the classroom from the kids who are distracted. I've been in classrooms with 3 photographers there, 3, 4 photographers there, the whole media onslaught, and the kids are working in groups, and they'll give us a look or two when we first come in, but if they're in the groups, usually they become oblivious to us pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I think a spotlight on that is when we evaluate teachers. When I evaluate teachers, I don't watch the teacher, I watch the kids. That's how you evaluate the teacher, is what are the students doing.
Yeah.
A quick thing, a bigger issue than we have time, just a minute or so left here, but the Shelby County schools are jumping into this lawsuit over BEP funding, which is the formula that the state uses. I'll start with you. Is your school system going to jump in that lawsuit? Are you happy that that lawsuit is going? Or what was your take on it?
We have not discussed or really even contemplated jumping in the lawsuit. I'll just say I'm very interested to see how it turns out.
Yeah. Your take?
Yeah, and the same as Ted's. We really haven't had the time to get into that, but we're watching very carefully what's going to happen because obviously it impacts all of us.
You'd like to see more funding, though.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. So if that's a byproduct, because the lawsuit is such that, it would be for all schools in the state, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I guess congratulations on a full year. Ted Horrell from Lakeland Schools, Tammy Mason from Arlington, Bill Dries. Thank you all for joining us. Join us again next week. Thanks. Good night.
DHG is a full-service accounting firm serving Memphis and the Mid-South region for more than 60 years, combining community involvement with the technical resources of a national firm. For more information, visit dhgllp.com.